We can also specify and plot sections in 3D. So in order to do that, we first of all initialize a viewer. And let's call it viewer. And start adding elements. So let's start with grid. So the function to create 3D sections is called view 3D underscore section. So this function is also available for all the spatial objects, just like section plot and view 3D, and is used to generate sections. However, those sections are displayed within the 3D interactive viewer. The nice thing about this function is that it uses a similar set of arguments as the section plot, so that if you were able to generate a 2D section on this object, you can basically use the same arguments to generate the same section but in 3D. That means that we can actually use the view variable that we have specified above. We just now need to say that we want to use the viewer we just created above and start adding some labels. So this will add the grid to my 3D visualization. Let's add more elements to it. So next I want to add my topo, and let's say this is topo, and I need to specify tolerances because it's a wireframe. So let's use 5 meters for this visualization. And next one, I want to add my low grade, low shell, and let's call it low shell, and that's all I need. And next one I want to add is my comps. View 3D section. This is the same. Let's just copy this part. Say composites. These are my composites. The tolerance here can still be 5. Viewer is the same viewer, and view. One thing that we can do, actually more tolerance for our composites, 25. But for the composites, as we saw above, we got some variables. So we can actually also add variables here. So that's the first argument. So let's add, I want to visualize copper, and I want to visualize my geology logs, which is geocode. So if I format my cells and run this, I can see my cross section. The default view of the 3D viewer is a top-down view. We can actually find the best view for our cross section with the viewer options. We have the up, the down, south, north, west, and east views. In this case, I'm going to use the west and zooming a little bit. So if I want to make this view the default view that's generated when I run this code, I can actually copy the parameters that I just manually selected by going to my camera and clicking in copy. And the way I use this information is going to the above cell and doing viewer dot and then Control V. And that will just copy what I got from the viewer. So this piece of code is generated when I press copy in here, and I just have to paste it above. You might want to format this cell. Let me just do that. And if I rerun this cell, it will generate the view, but now it's going to use the camera that I selected. If I wanted to generate the same section, the same view, but in a static function that I can save into a file and put in a report, we can use the static 3D view. So for every 3D view that you create with the viewer, you can do viewer dot show static, and just this will generate the figure. If I want to add some elements, I can capture the output. This function is generating as output a figure handle and an axis handle, and I can also change the figure size. Let's use 8. And lastly, because I provided labels, one thing that I can do is to add a legend. So to add legends, I can do axis.legend, and this will make sure the legend is added to the figure. So let's run it again. And now we have our cross section, a section of the view 3D in a static function, and we have our legends on the side. Before we move into flagging, I would like to talk a little bit more about the elements of the 3D viewer. So for instance, here we created the visualization of composites for copper and geocode, but so far we only looked into the copper values. In order to change the variables we are looking at, we can click on the object we want to edit and click on the variable. By default, it includes all the metadata, and we also see copper, which was our selection, and we also have geocode, which we also selected. So we can switch back and forth from different variables by select them in the drop-down menu. Another important feature here is that I can select a data location by right-clicking into it. So if I right-click, you can see that there's some information displayed on the right side. By default, it's going to show all the metadata, but also show, for instance, the copper value and the geocode variable, which are the two variables that I selected for visualization. Lastly, every time I make a selection, I can copy that information by clicking on the blue icon, and then that can be pasted into a cell with Ctrl V. So Ctrl V will paste that information as a dictionary. Other important features of the 3D viewers is the ability to remove and add objects from the view by using the check mark. And also we can change the way items are visualized. For instance, a low shell is currently being visualized as a surface, but another one that's pretty common is to visualize as a surface with edge. So that will add the edges of the triangulation. Maybe we just want to look at the wireframe itself, which is just edges, or maybe we just want the surface. So those are some features of the 3D viewers. And lastly, the last feature I would like to talk about. If I click here, I select the composite that I'm clicking at. But let's say I want to ignore this object while I'm clicking so it doesn't get selected. So that's why we have this pickable option in here. If I tag it off, now if I try to click at some location, it's just going to ignore the composites and it's just going to select from the grid, which is the object behind the composites. So that selected the grid node at that location.